Can you hear me? Okay.
Good morning. My name is Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. The director, Jason Marsack, who's the director of the Latin America Economic Growth Initiative, has a piece published in the National Review this morning that captures the gravity of what we'll be talking about today. And the headline sums it up in the following way: as Venezuela's democracy heads over a cliff, where's the international response? And I'll only just read one paragraph here because I think it sums up the situation we confront. It's been more than 100 days of ongoing opposition protests, with more than 100 killed and thousands injured in brazenly violent repression by the Maduro administration. With 176% inflation, many basic food supplies unavailable, and what food can be found is distributed corruptly. Last year, infant mortality shot up 30%, reaching the levels of the poorest sub-Saharan African nations, despite Venezuela's possessing the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And I can't tell you how many people who are not familiar with Venezuela actually understand that. The largest proven oil reserves in the world, 9 in 10 households are hungry or at risk of hunger. And the piece goes on, saying, ultimately, normally this would be a time when the international community would step in, using all available leverage to promote restoration of stability and peace, but that hasn't yet happened. So that's the setting for this enormously timely and significant event, where we'll dive into the political, economic, and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, as well as try to identify new ways to involve the international community, and particularly the U.S. and regional actors, in seeking solutions to the crisis. Here at the Atlantic Council, we earn our day's bread by convening leaders to find collaborative solutions to significant challenges. The challenges don't get much more significant than what we're facing in Venezuela in our own hemisphere. It is in that spirit that it gives me enormous pleasure, and it's a great honor, to welcome the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro. Mr. Secretary General, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been leading the diplomatic fight to encourage Venezuela to respect human rights and human dignity and walk forward on a democratic path. I'm also honored to welcome Luis Alfonso de Alba, the permanent representative of Mexico to the Organization of American States, and I know you've put forward a very important resolution as well for this situation. Let me also then briefly acknowledge the panelists who will be more fully introduced later. The Chief Economist of Torino Capital, Francisco Rodriguez, the Executive Director of CEPAS, Beatriz Borges, who have traveled long distances to be here today, Gustavo Alegre, and Fernanda Espinaza of NTN24. It's just wonderful to have you here today to discuss these issues. Venezuela was a decade ago one of the wealthiest countries in the region. But today, after years of economic and social mismanagement, is embroiled on a crisis on all fronts. And it is a crisis, as I said before, that demands global attention. We find ourselves today a week away from a vote to elect a constituent assembly that will likely rewrite the Constitution to the government's benefit. That follows a situation where more than 7 million Venezuelans symbolically voted last Sunday to reject this power grab in what the opposition called the biggest civic disobedience movement the world has seen. The international community has hit an unending series of roadblocks to find a resolution to the crisis, despite the Secretary General's best efforts. The Trump administration, for its part, has levied additional sanctions on individuals and is considering a broader set of sanctions. At the Atlantic Council, we believe that now is the time to double down on an effort that lays bare the violations and helps put further international pressure and attention on the need for change. So we're launching our own Venezuela strategy that will have three prongs. One of them is laying bare the atrocities committed by the Venezuelan government and putting forward a new plan for emerging from the crisis. The second is providing a roadmap for additional U.S. and regional efforts. And the third is drawing attention to the actions of international actors in Venezuela and the implications for U.S. national security and regional stability. So a good, broad, and ongoing and longer-term effort from the Adrienne Arche Latin America Center. As such, today's event marks the beginning of this effort on our part. We are lucky that the Secretary General could join us at this pivotal moment. Less than a week after the opposition plebiscite. I think we'll also hear something about the strike yesterday and some of the outcome of that as well. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the Secretary General, who was elected to lead the OAS in March 2015. Since he took office, he has led an incredible fight for peace and prosperity in Venezuela. Before coming to the OAS, he served as Uruguay's Foreign Affairs Minister, where he led several initiatives that gained Uruguay international recognition. Previously, he also served as senator in the Uruguayan Chamber of Senators and held several ambassadorial positions, including as Uruguay's ambassador to Germany and to China. So herzlich willkommen, Herr Botschafter. So not ambassador to China, but you were posted to China. But you were ambassador to Germany. Yeah, okay. So after he gives brief remarks, he'll sit down in a keynote conversation with Jason. Mr. Secretary General, I'll just end by saying that you're a consensus builder and a highly respected leader. You'll need all those skills right now. It is my true honor to welcome you today. The Secretary General will speak in Spanish. You have headphones. There'll be simultaneous translation. Thank you all for coming, and we look forward to your remarks, sir.
Muchas gracias por la...
Thank you for this invitation to the Atlantic Council and to be here with you. It is indeed a pleasure. The OAS is a political forum, probably the most complete in the hemisphere, where we have dialogue about rights and the well-being of citizens. This based on regional solidarity. The commitment of the hemisphere defending democracy is a way to strengthen relationships between countries, and the Inter-American Democratic Charter was a preventive measure. When the member states agreed about the mechanism that would protect democracies, they established a very explicit authority that would act in each of these signatory countries when necessary. So this could prevent or stop any going backwards or deterioration of these democracies that have cost so much to acquire in the region. One of the tragedies of Venezuela is that if there had been a willingness to apply the charter and to comply with it, we could have perhaps avoided what has happened in the country. In Venezuela, when you act in defense of democracy, if we had acted in defense of democracy, This would have avoided the situation from reaching the point it has now, where it is a security and humanitarian crisis, with a government that has undermined democracy to the point of becoming a real dictatorship. Yes, it is true that Venezuela should solve its own problems. However, when the words of civilians and have the government act with weapons against them, then we have to reestablish the order internationally. We should do this to establish fundamental rights in the country. When the people of Venezuela went out to protest for their rights, the government instituted terroristic actions, and they have systematically violated this disarmed people. They have killed more than 100 people in 100 days, almost a person per day. The number of wounded goes beyond 15,000. Until July 12th, there were 244 political prisoners, the highest number of people in its recent history. And these statistics include loss of life as the humanitarian crisis worsens, because many of them are dying for lack of food and medicines for chronic diseases. Almost 2 million people have left the country in the past 3 years because of lack of no rule of law. Then the crisis has worsened. So Venezuela has to make a great effort to improve the situation, the well-being of its citizenry. And this is insufferable for the country. The police, the judges, everybody has been co-opted, and the country cannot be managed this way. When the violence comes from the government and its institutions, then the problem is even greater. When drug trafficking is within the state and its institutions, then that challenge is completely new to our continent. So to dismantle, it's not just dismantling a dictatorship, but the drug traffickers from the state of Venezuela. The Venezuelan government has systematically rejected humanitarian aid offers. However, but it has bought arms with the bit of resources they still have. Every death in Venezuela should hurt the whole international community. It is especially hurtful and painful for this hemisphere. It is our responsibility to defend the people of Venezuela and denounce all human rights violations and the violent situation it is going through. Last Sunday, the people went out on the streets to defend democracy. 7.5 million people called to the armed forces of Venezuela to defend the Constitution. They asked government employees to respect the Constitution. They asked for free and transparent elections as a democratic solution to this crisis. This is something that should be done by a people. These people went in spite of their fear and what they were being threatened by from the government. The people are claiming all their rights, and they should be listened to. And there is more worth and value in those people than in all the oil they have. But the government has decided to use torture and leave blood on the streets. Those people cannot be underestimated. The first clue to recover democracy and rule of law is that Venezuelan citizenry. Nobody should forget, no government should forget its people to govern and also to be the opposition. This is the main problem of the present government. They do not connect with the needs of the people. and to treat the people as an amorphous mass that that is malleable and you can mold to your own desire, that is the worst thing a politician should do. And that goes for the opposition as well as the government. So we have not learned from the previous dictatorships that characterized opposition to democracy in the second part of the 20th century. We didn't learn from that. We should have never allowed this to happen. The OAS is the only political forum that has spoken about this crisis. It is the only one that is discussing the problem of Venezuela permanently. We have Luis Alfonso de Alva, the ambassador, who inspired the resolution that was passed on April 3rd, which declares that there has been constitutional alteration in Venezuela, and it calls for Venezuela to restore democracy according to the principles of the OAS Charter and Inter-American one. So the regime had all this impunity to torture, to kill, but they don't have that anymore, according to what we have said. And our voices have to be made louder because we're still going through a process where it is necessary to consolidate what Venezuela needs, the program that it needs. What we pointed out on May 30th to the Permanent Council. We presented this, and we were trying to have this recall referendum that was calling for new, free, transparent elections. All political prisoners should be freed. The powers of the state should be reinstated. We need an emergency plan to take care of those who are in the greatest need, those who are suffering from lack of food and medicine. And we should also be harsh and contain this to be coherent. There is still work to be done. And what we have done has already brought Venezuela closer to a solution, but the people of Venezuela have inspired us to find a solution at the cost of their own lives, and those lives should be respected, and so should the people of Venezuela. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Secretary.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I will.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Marzak, and I lead the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. And let me reiterate Fred's words. We are honored to have you here today for the launch of our new Venezuela work. And please join me again, everyone, in applauding the Secretary General for all of his work every day on behalf of the Venezuelan people. Thank you for all you're doing. Now, I'll tell you, those who know the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Atlantic Council know that we like to try to focus on the positive transformations happening in Latin America, and there are many such transformations, but Venezuela is certainly not one of them. We will do everything here to lay the groundwork for a better Venezuela, for a Venezuela where the people can live in peace and security, and a Venezuela that is a partner rather than a blight in the region's transformation. We've talked about the numbers, which are staggering, and with those in mind, let's discuss some of the pressing issues facing Venezuela and the international community, and then we'll open up to questions. I see this is a full room with many cameras in the back, so I want to make sure that we have time for a few questions from everybody here. Mr. Secretary General, the major governments of the hemisphere, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Canada, Colombia, Peru, the US, and others, all supported the recent OAS effort to pass a resolution on Venezuela last month in Cancun. Yet the organization has hit political roadblocks. You mentioned in a testimony on Wednesday before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that just countries that represent just 10% of the population of the Americas prevented that resolution from moving forward. What in your mind explains that continuing political support for the Venezuelan government on behalf of that group of countries?
Eso también me fue preguntado en el...
That was also asked of me by the Senate, and my response is the same.
Los países tienen intereses.
The countries have national interests, and due to this, sometimes they inspire their actions, and they affect the work they do in the international stage. So these international actions that are based on these national interests is a constant practice. This country does it as well, almost all the time. So we cannot judge anyone for acting this way. There is logic for the Bolivarian government. The last 15 years, at least, they established strong ties with countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. They have created economic interests, political interests, and so that logic is not easy to undo when we're speaking of certain principles and values, because when you see them on paper, they seem abstract, but in the case of Venezuela, we see the practical importance that those principles and values have, and what fundamental values really mean to the life of people and their social behavior and political behavior, as we have seen in Venezuela. The separation of powers affects the institutions of a certain country, and they can be eroded if not taken care of. And the Republican probity, how the variables in this Venezuelan regime have also affected these variables. So all of that together does play a role when things come to a certain point. So the countries have made their decisions in a sovereign way, and I cannot judge any decision of any country. But this has been an evolution. Last year, when we were only a lone voice within the continent, there were now 20 countries that supported the process in Cancun, and those countries would have been enough to act and vote to apply the Inter-American Democratic Charter, but not in the ministerial meeting. That was more not a problem of the 20 votes, but the procedure that was selected.
The Trump administration has levied sanctions on individuals back in May, and is currently considering a broader set of actions. In the U.S. Congress and the Senate, S-1018 is a bipartisan bill under consideration that would provide humanitarian assistance for the Venezuelan people. And so the new U.S. government is very much focused on the situation in Venezuela. From your perspective, what would be some of the most effective ways, maybe even taking off your hat as a Secretary General of the OAS, or even working outside of, kind of in addition to the OAS, that the U.S. could be most effective, things that this administration should be considering? One piece of action under consideration is the potential of oil sanctions, for example. In your opinion, what would be some of the most effective things that this administration could do to really, on behalf of the Venezuelan people?
I'm not capable of taking off my OAS Secretary General hat off for even a minute, or else they'll kick me out entirely. Bueno, intente. No, it's true. So actions taken by the U.S. administration have been very positive in terms of applying pressure to the regime. That is true. Sanctions applied against the vice president and against the Constitutional Assembly have been very positive.
Y vemos muy positivo también que ulteriores sanciones vayan a venir.
And we think that future sanctions would be very positive. Sanctions are the highest or the strongest international tool for applying pressure. And we want to we don't believe there should ever be any kind of military intervention. That is absolutely an unacceptable option. So the highest form of pressure is, in fact, to apply sanctions. Sanctions apply pressure, but they in no way resolve issues of internal pressures in a country, however. International pressures can certainly help. We've seen examples. We saw it in the instance of apartheid. External pressures definitely accelerated the fall of that regime, but there they worked because there was also very strong pressure from the inside, people that were committed to the idea of one vote for every single person. When the internal pressure isn't there, the external pressure is not sufficient. And the obvious example of that is the Cuban dictatorship. No matter how hard the pressures from the outside, it didn't work. People left, but there wasn't a pressure.
Very critically, as we've talked about, there's a Constituent Assembly vote, which will be on July 30, 9 days from today. I'd like to ask what your top concerns are of what might transpire in the next 9-10 days, in the next couple of weeks, in the next couple of months. What are people potentially not talking about that they should be concerned about, or not thinking about they should be concerned about, as they're looking ahead to what might transpire in the short term and the medium term as well?
Mira, como señalé ahora, los problemas se resuelven escuchando al pueblo.
Well, I believe that problems are solved by listening to the people. If the government had listened to the people, the problems would already be solved. If everything that the people tried to express in September and October of last year, if the government had truly listened, then we would be looking at an entirely different situation today. If all the signatures of the people asking for a recall had been respected, the situation would be different. What we have now is a tragedy. 100 dead in protests, that is a tragedy. The voice of the people must be heard. The scale of the tragedy is something that should be paid attention to by the government and by the opposition. So what's the underlying issue here? I always say, no matter how many times you chase your tail in a circle, your tail still stays behind you. The focus of negotiations has not always been on Venezuela's true agenda. Elections, freedom for political prisoners, these are the true issues. That's what the people need. We have some 10 days more for the government and the opposition to reach an agreement on the basis of what the country truly needs.
I'm sure there's more than that. And if you could just keep it just your name, affiliation, and a quick question, no commentary, please. I saw the hand first here in the fifth row here on the aisle, and And the second question was then toward the back.
Gracias, Sebastián Pitar de la Universidad de los Andes en Bogotá.
Thank you. I'm from the University of the Andes in Bogota.
Secretario, ¿qué esperanza da la
Secretary
gestión del
General,
presidente Santos en Cuba y qué
what
incentivos positivos puede ofrecer la
hope
comunidad
is there in
al
President
gobierno Maduro para
Santos's
que
efforts in
finalmente
Cuba,
reciba
and what do you think of the options of Maduro giving up power?
Second question, I'll take them together. Right over on the side, please. Thank you. Someone who didn't get a seat but gets to ask a question.
Thank you. Secretario, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Secretary General Sergio Diaz from Voice of America. There are some rumors that the Congress and the White House may issue new sanctions involving an oil embargo. If this were to occur, would it be effective? Given that this would affect all Venezuelans equally and not just the government? Yes, well, the efforts of President Santos, which have been underway for months, come on top of efforts being made by other countries as well in an attempt to help resolve Venezuela's crisis. I believe the entire international community, particularly in the hemisphere, should align with what was said by the Venezuelan people July 16th. We must resolve specific issues, the issues that the people themselves have highlighted. That's what needs to happen. People are demonstrating. It's not about specific political leaders. They're out in the streets, regardless of what the leaders tell them, whether government or opposition leaders. So those people know what they want, and that should be respected by those operating within the country and by the players without. That voice was heard clearly July 16th. Any manipulation of that, any effort to ignore that sovereign voice will just lead to a repetition of what happened the first weeks of November and December of last year. And it's what brought us here. At that time, there was an institutional solution for Venezuela. It was the recall referendum, but a different path was chosen.
They have been playing games with the dialogue since they started, since March last year. So that is the problem that should be addressed. Not allow the government to play games, not internationally, not internally. Nuevas sanciones.
Okay, on the topic of new sanctions.
Sí. Nosotros no vemos que
yes. Well, we don't see that we don't see the profits of oil sales benefiting the Venezuelan people. The expectations are that, well, we see child mortality and maternal mortality and child malnutrition being at rates higher than in places like Syria. They've reached their worst levels in the history of Venezuela. They're the worst in the country. We're seeing epidemics arise that had been eradicated decades ago. People are dying because they're not receiving treatment for their chronic illnesses. Venezuelans have died of malnutrition. None of the oil profits benefit the people. They're going to the regime. They're being used to buy support. They're being used to buy the weapons of repression. They're being used to kill Venezuelans who are the true owners of the resources of that country that the regime is using for itself. So I don't see the oil profits going to the people. I do believe that there are other options in play, that there are targeted sanctions, sanctions targeting high-level authorities within the regime. That would be one step prior to general sanctions, and I think an analysis would need to be made of the collateral damage that could be caused by a general sanction. We have to see whether the government could find a way to bypass those sanctions. And further, you would need to determine what the effect would be on the hemispheric community. What percentage of countries would be willing to sign on to such sanctions? And again, what might be some of the collateral damage on the people themselves? So that is an analysis that does need to be completed first. Once that analysis has been made, we need to start with individual sanctions. To that chain of command that has caused the 100 deaths of protesters, the Minister of the Interior, the National Guard, the Minister of Defense, the Supreme Court, the National Electoral Council, there are top authorities that are guilty of torture in the prisons. Those people should be subject to individual sanctions. So we have to analyze those options. We're going to be taking an important institutional step in studying whether the crimes committed by the regime, particularly torture, could be judged as crimes under the Rome Statute and therefore could be tried in the International Court. So that is an institutional step that we will be taking today and will likely announce tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your remarks and for sharing with us your perspectives.
For your fight every day on behalf of the Venezuelan people. Muchas gracias por todo.
Thank you.
Reset for our panel discussion. I'd like to take this opportunity to announce the first new tangible product as part of our Venezuela strategy. Response to the fact that truly understanding, or better yet, acting on the depth of the crisis requires digesting some of the horrible numbers coming out of the country. Our Venezuela Tracker is a one-stop comprehensive source of up-to-date information on the economic, political, social, and financial crises. It's a resource of hard-to-get, often unattainable, but yet reliable data that we have gathered, led by two of my colleagues, Andrea Murta, Andrea Saldarriaga, working with a number of people and organizations both in and out of Venezuela. This is an ongoing effort, and I invite all of you to go to atlanticcouncil.org/Venezuela Tracker to find the latest numbers on what people are living through every day right here in our own hemisphere. Today we are launching a beta version with painstakingly gathered financial and economic data on topics ranging from GDP to inflation to external debt and exchange rates, and we thank Francisco Rodriguez, one of our panelists, for his help. Our next set of data that will go online will look in depth at poverty, hunger, and health situation in Venezuela, and thank you to our panelist Beatriz Borges for her help, among others, in that effort. And this is something that we will continuously update because we want to provide a clear picture for the entire world of what is occurring in Venezuela, but also offer a tool for organizations, governments, civil society, media, and others who are working hard to help the citizens of Venezuela and often find it difficult to get reliable, real-time data. At a time when the government is making an effort to keep the information nation hostage. We want to do exactly the opposite. Now I'm going to take a moment and introduce our panelists and then ask them to take the stage. Our first panelist now is Luis Alfonso de Alba. Luis Alfonso is a Mexican ambassador at the Organization of American States, having assumed his role in May of 2016. He's a career diplomat. He's served in a number of positions, including ambassador to Austria, ambassador to the United Nations office in Geneva. And as we've discussed earlier today, he is also one of the foremost leaders at the OAS on the situation in Venezuela, somebody who fundamentally understands what is happening in the country and is taking a leadership role in that regard. Francisco Rodriguez is the chief economist at Tordino Capital, a New York-based investment bank and broker-dealer. Prior to joining the bank, he served as the director and senior Andean economist at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. Francisco was also the director of the Venezuelan Congressional Budget Office, and I'm thrilled that Francisco is here because he really has his fingers on the pulse of the economic situation in Venezuela. And then also Beatriz Borges, who's the executive director for the Center for Justice and Peace in Venezuela, that works to document human rights violations and provide legal counsel to many of the people who are being held hostage by the government. She has a special focus on women's rights. She previously worked at the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Venezuela, where she researched human rights protection mechanisms. Beatriz also got up at 2 o'clock in the morning to be able to come from Venezuela because of the fact that the flying out in the middle of the night makes it more likely that they'll actually let you leave the country. So thank you very much, Beatriz, for doing that. And our moderator today is the U.S. News Director for NTN 24, Gustavo Alegret. Gustavo has over 20 years experience working in communications, covering political campaigns in the United States and in Spain. He's also served as in the Ministry of Commerce and Tourism in Catalonia at the IDB. And as mentioned at the outset, we're also thankful to Gustavo and his team for their partnership in our Venezuela effort, tracker, and a whole host of other things. So with that, I'd like to welcome Gustavo, our three panelists, to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the panelists. I'm not going to introduce you because this has been done. Just a couple of questions, a couple of points. If you want to follow and contribute to the conversation in our social media, use hashtag ACVenezuela. And if you want to mention also the media partner of this event, at NTN24. The debate is going to start 15-20 minutes, and then we will open for Q&A at the end. This is a debate, dear panelists. So what we expect is a conversation among us, not single individual speeches. Thank you. And I would like to start with Ambassador Luis Alfonso de Alba. You are a diplomat. You are a diplomat with a long career. You know how difficult sometimes is do a good diplomacy. And you are in a position today in the Organization of American States with a very critical topic, which is Venezuela. Mexico has evolved its position from a more prudent position to a more active and more pushing position. What has changed for Mexico to take this stage in diplomatic terms?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here this morning. First of all, I'm not so sure we have changed. I think if you go back and you look into the history of diplomatic relations of Mexico has been a very active country on a number of occasions on which human rights, democracy were at stake. The Central American conflict, the situation in Chile, the recognition of the opposition in El Salvador, just to mention a few topics. But particularly since '93 at the World Conference on Human Rights, we were very eager to make it clear that you cannot invoke sovereignty or non-intervention to violate the human rights.
But somebody could say Cuba has also is a country who also violates the human rights.
But it's a different
and the position
situation.
of Mexico is different.
It's a different situation, and we have always considered it quite different. We have pushed Cuba to do much better on human rights, but you have to make clear what the differences are, and the main difference is the level of support, the level of legitimacy, if you want, and the situation on which Cuba has been placed by the U.S. We were the only country at the OAS to oppose the suspension of Cuba in the 60s. And this is not the same situation today, because you have obviously not only commitments on human rights, commitments on democracy with the Inter-American Democratic Charter, but you have a majority of the population clearly expressing themselves, and last weekend was a proof of it. So for us it's quite important to go back to these very important principles and look ourselves into a mirror. The situation in Mexico, the situation in any other country in the hemisphere needs to be compared with the situation in Venezuela, because we do not want to face a similar situation.
Humanitarian crisis in Venezuela.
Humanitarian crisis, populistic governments, authoritarian regime, lack of respect of institutions. It has been so difficult to build democracy, human rights institutions. We need to protect them.
Beatriz, you have worked in justice and democracy, and your work sometimes has been difficult, I would say dangerous at some point, because you are denouncing a very critical topic for the Venezuelan government. Could you help us to just portray how dangerous is the situation today in Venezuela?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to work about the situation in my country, the very bad situation, and for the space to try to explain what is happening really in Venezuela. I'm going to continue in Spanish. Mi perspectiva en esta
My perspectives on this conversation have to do with my role. I come from the civil society. I'm a human rights defender, and our work in recent years has been to help the victims. In countries where there is the rule of law, see, I'm an attorney, so it's a legal matter and institutions and applying the protections of the state. However, we are in a completely different situation. People are speaking of a humanitarian crisis, but we see that we have an emergency on our hands, and a complex humanitarian emergency, because in Venezuela there are no resources for dealing with this crisis, and that's why it's not a crisis, it's an emergency. So it's important to use the right term for what's happening. Now, it is humanitarian because Venezuelans are dying. Those statistics that are so shocking, that's the reality that we are living. We see a child dying of malnutrition because her mother can't buy milk, or a child dying because they can't get an antibiotic, or people because they can't find a dialysis machine. People who can't buy insulin or get high blood pressure medicine. My mother couldn't get medicine that used to be so easy to find anywhere else. 200,000 people have chronic illnesses that normally for anyone else aren't a problem because you go to the pharmacy to buy your medicine, but we can't. You said you come from civil society. So what impact or role do pro-Chavez have in the civil society? Because if it's a permanent crisis and the aid doesn't come, or the oil profits, as Secretary Almagro said, don't benefit them, then doesn't the support for the regime erode? Aren't people looking for a way out? Doesn't this lead people to join the opposition? What support is there for the official government. No, but that's what makes it so complicated. This government has a monopoly, a control over the food, over medicine, over everything. So if you've heard about the CLAP and these different mechanisms that they use, and now, of course, this manipulation that they're using with the Constitutional Assembly. There are all sorts of tricks they use to buy people's support and buy people's vote. There are veiled threats. You know, we hope that you and your family will support me. If anyone doesn't support them, they're persecuted. So a lot of the support that the government does enjoy has to do with this persecution that's undermining human rights, and civil society that's defending human rights. We're willing to do our work, and we'll do our work no matter who the government is. This government happens to be a human rights violator. We want democracy, but we are unprotected. We help victims, our organization, but with this crisis, in May of 2016, we turned to the Supreme Court of Justice. Our complaint hasn't even been accepted, hasn't been admitted. There is absolutely no protection in place. We've received no response. Well, what percentage of support do you think there is within Venezuelan society for Nicolás Maduro? Well, I think you can see that in the plebiscite. It was low, pretty low. Well, of course, because people don't have a sense of normalcy. And what we want, of course, is to exercise our right to express ourselves via the vote.
Help us to briefly understand the magnitude of the economic situation in Venezuela.
Okay, well, I can start out by giving you some numbers, and sometimes numbers are really very cold to talk about this type of reality, which is at a very basic level a human tragedy, as Beatriz was telling us. The Venezuelan economy between 2012 and 2016 contracted by 28%. That's a decline in per capita income in Venezuela. This year, we're looking at an additional contraction, which according to varying estimates could go from 5 to 10, 15%. If you add that in, we'll have a contraction in per capita income of close to 40%, between 35 and 40%. Let's put that in magnitude. There are only 6 countries in the world in this century that have had this magnitude of economic contraction. We're talking about Syria, the Central African Republic, Palestine, Iraq, United Arab Emirates. Of those countries, all but one of them are countries that have been at war. So effectively, it's a type of contraction that we see in associated with armed conflict. If you look just at Latin American economic history, actually, well, there are only 2 countries that kind of compete with this magnitude of contraction. One of them is Nicaragua during the 1970s, also during the time of the insurgency of the Sandinista revolution, and the other one is Peru during the hyperinflation. Venezuela has already surpassed Peru. Probably this year will surpass Nicaragua and become the largest economic contraction in Latin American economic history, at least in recorded Latin American economic history. So yes, this is a huge contraction. What's it due to? I mean, obviously, it has to do with economic mismanagement. It has to do with policy mistakes, wrong economic policies, and it also has to do with the decline in oil revenues. And here's something that, and these 2 facts interact. So Venezuela back in 2012 exported $98 billion. Oil prices fell, and last year it exported $28 billion. Now, that's the decline in oil prices. It's also a decline in oil production because Venezuela has invested enough in its oil industry so as to be able to maintain production. So it's one of the few OPEC countries, the other one's Libya, that's also gone through a political crisis, that's also seen a decline in oil production. So there's this interaction between mismanagement and less resources. But there is something that I do want to contend, and I think that this will add to the debate. The evidence from the past 4 years that we have is that when Venezuela has less external resources, Venezuelan people suffer. Venezuelan living standards have declined significantly over the past 4 years as a result of the decline in Venezuelan revenues. And I expect that if Venezuelan revenues continue to decline, be it, for example, because of oil-related sanctions, then there will be a continued economic contraction in Venezuela, and there will be continued human suffering associated with it.
Francisco, talking about oil, Secretary Almagro mentioned the collateral consequences of sanctions over the Venezuelan oil. What would be, in your opinion, from someone who is an economist, those collateral effects over the population?
I think they could be huge. I think that we have to be very careful thinking about oil sanctions to Venezuela. And let me explain something about the structure of the Venezuelan economy. 95% of Venezuelan exports are oil, and they are directly controlled by the Venezuelan state. So what that means is that everything that Venezuela does, everything that Venezuela imports from the rest of the world, it is done through the state with the resources that the state has access to. So this poses a relatively difficult problem. I mean, and imagine that we were talking about another country that has a private sector that's somehow integrated to the rest of the world. Well, if you have a private sector that generates export revenue and you have a public sector, you can cut the lifeline to the government without cutting the lifeline to the people. But in the case of Venezuela, if you cut the lifeline to the government, that is the lifeline to the people. I mean, Venezuela imports food. I mean, this is not only verifiable, it's the only way in which things come into Venezuela is with the dollars that the government has. So Venezuela imports food with the dollars from oil exports. If you cut those, you're going to cut the resources that the government has to undertake repression. You're also going to cut the resources that the government has in order to undertake food imports. So it's a very difficult problem to design these sanctions in ways that do not affect the Venezuelan people. And what I'm concerned is that we have a humanitarian crisis, we have a humanitarian emergency. If Venezuelan oil exports fall by another $10 billion and imports come down by another $10 billion, this humanitarian crisis and emergency could turn into a humanitarian catastrophe.
Briefly, please.
Sobre todo porque nosotros nos preocupa el tema de las sanciones y
especially because we are concerned by sanctions in a human rights sense. Because of corruption and drug trafficking, we're also concerned what can affect the people. Let's imagine that this is a building where we all live, and there's one apartment where the family is fighting, the mother is hitting the kids, and the husband is hitting the wife. And we can say, well, we don't live in that one apartment, so it doesn't matter. But you have to say something about it. But if we cut their water, their light, who will suffer from it? Everybody in the building, because you'd have to cut the light for the whole building. So solidarity at an international level regarding institutions that should be solidarious in collaboration with civil society should be done jointly with any action taken towards or against Venezuela. A ver, al embajador.
Community impose sanctions on the oil exports from Venezuela?
Déjame contestar en español ahora.
Por favor.
I will have to answer in Spanish. It's a more delicate answer or question to this, because it's more complex. There is no possibility to do it at the international community level except for the Security Council. It would have to be the Security Council who took action. It is almost impossible that something such as certain other sanctions would be approved at the United Nations in the General Assembly. That would be an option that's never been done at the OAS, for instance. But I think that the question of whether it would be a good or a bad idea, I think what's most important is that it has not been a punitive exercise, what we're trying to do, and it has not been led by the U.S. This has been a collective vision that has evolved internationally and that has tried to find all diplomatic ways to solve the problem. It was presented to do it with the democratic charter and suspend Venezuela at the OAS, all the states said, well, no, not yet. We have to first do everything possible at a diplomatic level. And then we went with this extraordinary assembly and consultations, and the answer is exactly that. We were trying to send a message to the Venezuelans that we're still looking for some type of resolution through mediation or something like that. And this, apart from the fact that we don't want to hurt the population anymore with sanctions. But sanctions should not only be considered economically, they should be taken into account in a political light, because there could be a political sanction, an exclusion, such as Mercosur is doing, or what's happening in UNASUR, or what could happen at a certain time if there were more embassies that left Venezuela. So there are a group of measures that could be taken before any of these sanctions could be applied or should be applied. And we will talk about this next week at the Permanent Council at the OAS. What are they concerned about specifically? At this time, I'll go back for a little bit to Cancun. Cancun was not a defeat for us. It was a rupture of CARICOM. And so CARICOM doesn't work anymore. It doesn't help Venezuela. We don't need it. The rest of the countries don't need it. So what was put down in Cancun, or what was not accepted, was a decision of CARICOM, and therefore CARICOM fractured, and they either went against or abstention to a project proposed by CARICOM. So that was something sad, but it was important. Today, we will try to include the subject once again as G14, and we'll continue to work as such. Yes, we're exercising pressure so that they do it within the OAS, that they're trying to promote that diplomatic pressure on Venezuela, and led by Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, and the United States and Canada. So this exercise, going back to your question on sanctions, I think that it should be dealt with at the level of the G14. There should be coordinated actions, some unilateral. I am not against any economic measure, but perhaps other type of economic measures.
Interesting. There are some numbers.
Sorry about what? You speak so fast.
Okay. I speak in, it's a Venezuelan accent.
Oh, okay. My Spanish accent is much.
Right. So you asked about the popularity, the approval of the government, and there are some numbers that put that number at around 20%. It's an interesting number because it's not as low as you would expect given the magnitude of the contraction, and there's a very interesting debate that precisely Beatriz was alluding to, is this intimidation or is this genuine? But we do know that in the past, in the not so distant past, Chavismo has been electorally successful, so that there's some part of this that apparently is genuine. We also know that, interestingly, for example, in these poll numbers, Hugo Chavez comes out as having a relatively high approval rating. So Venezuelans don't reject Chavismo as a whole. They might reject the government of Maduro, but they do carry at least a good memory of President Chavez. Now, of course, that's associated with the fact that he governed over the oil boom, that conditions were good during his time, but that's a political reality to think in terms of transition. But I also wanted to point out and to bring back this point to sanctions, because you have a very unpopular government right now, and a government that any election that is held, they would lose it by a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio. That's what all of the polls tell you. However, we also partnered with the polling firm, the respected Venezuelan polling firm, Dataanalysis, to evaluate the effect of sanctions. We're going to publish these results in our report on Monday, our Venezuela This Week report, which is published by Torino Capital. But I wanted to anticipate one of the results. We asked people what their opinion would be of an oil-related sanctions to to impede the purchase of Venezuelan oil by the United States. 28% of Venezuelans would support it, 62% of Venezuelans would oppose it. So there's also a very big risk that the policy measures being considered right now would backfire politically in terms of giving the government more support and allowing the government to characterize these international policy actions as things that are hurting Venezuelans.
Nos quedan 3-4 minutos. Beatriz, brevemente.
We have about 3 or 4 minutes. Beatriz, it's been over 100 days and people have gone to the streets. There are people dead and injured. Does civil society, are they afraid that this constant going out to the streets and may tire out some of the citizens, and therefore there will not be enough pressure or enough people going out on the streets? Those of us who go out to march, we know when we go out that there's a high probability of being arrested, injured, or assassinated by the representatives of the government that are abusing their control of these specific or peaceful manifestations. So I think that we still feel we have to go for looking for a peaceful way of protesting. Those of us who want restoration of democracy, we're trying to do it in a peaceful manner. We're trying to find all democratic ways and proposals. Our last mass protest wanted to show what we want to do and obtain. The violent focuses or episodes are generated by the government who are trying to repress these protests. So the citizenry is activating, mobilizing. Of course, these violations of human rights are a message to stop this, but we're still active and we're still going to fight democratically to obtain international solidarity and all our compatriots and brothers and sisters in Latin America so that they help us with something that we cannot wait any longer for and takes lives every day.
To the last topic that you mentioned, which was the CARICOM. The future, the G40 is a very solid group, but you need more votes. You need the necessary votes as much as possible, but the necessary votes to move forward resolutions within the Organization of American States. Taking into consideration that in Cancun, CARICOM is split in two, what are going to be the next step of the G14 to gain those votes, or at least half of them?
Well, let me...
If you want to use Spanish, you can. I mean, the Atlantic Council is pressing me to use my English. But,
con esa opción me quedo con el español.
So if you give me that option, I will use Spanish then. I believe, and it's something we are discussing within the G14, I don't think it's worth exercising pressure on the Caribbean. It is very clear which countries are on our side, the 6 that were in favor of the resolution, and we are grateful, and we want to protect them and help them because they're being pressured within CARICOM. And we should just forget about getting the other ones. You won't get the votes then. It doesn't matter. We're right. We have the political weight. The first example would be next Wednesday. We have the Permanent Council so that we put this on the agenda. The G14 will get there and we will debate it. And if we don't get the 4 votes that we need, we will still discuss it because there are other points on the program. And I don't care if we speak of it as a priority or one of the least, but we will speak of it. And it will cost them. There have to be consequences to the reactions of the Caribbean, and the consequences should be suffered by those who voted against or abstained. There are national interests, and we recognize that, but what you cannot do is go into a negotiation and then not comply with the vote. That you should not and cannot do. This was a negotiation that had happened in groups, and there were two sets of negotiators, and there was something that went wrong there, and it should be made clear that there's some people that were not faithful to their word, what they had promised. And I think the more important issue is that we will act independently of the votes. Why? Because the OAS is an anachronistic organization. Someday we'll change it, but we can't do it from night to day. I'm going to ask something pretty delicate. After the failure in Cancun, okay, the resolution didn't pass. It wasn't a failure. The press does call it a failure, and the diplomacy tries to manipulate the media, right? Well, we had almost everybody on our side. The analysis that were done later were that CARICOM depends on Venezuelan oil. Two, they are hostage to the drug traffickers and corruption. Venezuela knows some of these cases and therefore controls them. So what do you agree or disagree with? I think that there is an economic reliance, but also there is some honest gratitude on the part of many of them, because Venezuela during many years had a solidarious policy towards the development of many of those islands that other countries did not have. So that includes the U.S., but includes Mexico and others that had sporadic presence in the Caribbean, and that has a lot to do with it. The drug trafficking issue undoubtedly has some repercussions, but it's more isolated. I think in a general sense, everybody acknowledges, and there is the issue of oil, but also in great measure the projection of an integral development packet that we've never understood, but that Venezuela did understand. So they tried to articulate it and give it a certain sense. But that's something we could correct. I don't see why we're not doing it, because it is not great amounts of dollars. It's more political will that's involved. A ver si se puede presentar los que quieran hacer preguntas y a quién le dirigen la pregunta. I'm addressing the question to Francisco Rodriguez and Rafael Castillo. I am Rafael Castillo.
Firm comes from the government and the narco dictatorship. So I don't like to speculate. I like to go to the source. And the question goes, are you aware of any capital from the narco dictatorship? And if so, wouldn't that be helping the regime maintaining power?
That is completely false. All of our financial statements.
Eso es completamente falso. Todo es auditado por la SEC y eso es falso. No es así. Segunda pregunta.
What? If any firm accepts money from the government, yes, they would be helping the government stay in power. Yes.
Okay, let's go over there. That woman, please. Yes. Use your voice.
Use my voice.
Yeah.
Okay. Catalina Casas from the Wilson Center. Mi pregunta va dirigida al embajador.
Casas from the Wilson Center. My question goes to Ambassador Luis and Luis Alfonso. If the bloc actions and all these efforts have not worked, what are the countries in the region waiting for to take action and act unilaterally and perhaps help the Venezuelan people? Colombia? I have a different idea on whether this has worked or failed, and I will go back to about a year ago before the Secretary General presented his first report. You couldn't even discuss this at the OAS, that now it is being discussed frequently, and all these efforts are being made, and some resolutions have been approved and others no. The April 3rd one, the press were saying that they had not obtained the 17 votes, but it was perhaps ignorance, not that they were being mean, the press. The proposal I made at the time was to adopt it without voting, and when you adopt a resolution without votes, what you count is that there is no opposition, and there was no opposition. In fact, that resolution was accepted by consensus, which makes it even more valuable, but these are technicalities. So going back to what is being done or what will they do, I think that this matter is before the OAS, within the OAS, and what we are doing in helping the Venezuelans is something that is always being considered, but it's not just being done at the OAS, it's being done bilaterally and in subgroups within the region. In Mercosur, the presidents got together and the Minister of Foreign Relations. And yesterday, the ministers of foreign relations from Peru and Mexico got together and they discussed the matter. We're also discussing possibilities from other types of actions. The strength of this exercise lies in understanding that there is a collective vision of a process that should take place. If people believe that's enough, because you cannot force a government, in this case the Venezuelan government, to act, then I think they're wrong. I think that pressure has to continue at that level. It will not be military pressure. We don't have coercive measures to use. There are no governments or supranational institutions that would do this, and nor would it be desirable for them to exist. Pedro Aurelia from Venezuela. You speak of some types of things that are being found out where there will be sanctions or not. The problem that you described about Venezuela, and you did so very well, you compared it historically, isn't this the product of something worse than sanctions? The Venezuelan people will not suffer because the U.S. imposes sanctions or another government, but what the government has done with the oil industry in Venezuela, because I don't know if people assign responsibility to the government for hunger, for the violence, if you're speaking of this economic contraction, and that it was mismanagement of their income, and so wouldn't it be absurd at this point in history that one little bit more of pressure will harm Venezuela when the harm's already been done? That's an excellent question. In the first place, yes, it has been measured. And the government does. The people do blame the government, and that's why they're not popular. So it hasn't gone down as much as the economic crisis of 2012. What is my fear of the sanctions? And this is a controversial moment, but it's important to clarify this. In 2003, President Chavez had 30% approval. Now Maduro has 20%, not too far from there, and the opposition is mobilizing to have some type of election in Venezuela so that they can change the government. And there was a fundamental change that happened in 2002 in December. Venezuelan people said, since we cannot force this referendum, let's have a general indefinite strike. And that happened for about 2 months. It was indefinite in time because they weren't able to achieve their purpose, so they stopped striking. So that event marked a point in the thinking of the people. And that's when Chavez gained some points of approval. So the reason I'm afraid and what I'm afraid of is I have a great deal of fear that when it has been very clear until now, Moises Naim said, what we have to do with the governments of Maduro and Chavez is to leave them alone, because when you leave them alone, they will do the harm they're doing and people will realize it is their fault. So there are other factors that complicate the situation that might give credibility to the story that Maduro is trying to tell, that it is all the external factors that are harming the people, etc. That's why I think that it's important to take into account and measure what the effect of public opinion is. All I'm saying is there is an important risk. I have no doubt that the main responsibility of what is happening in Venezuela has to do with the government policies. But the risk exists that if sanctions are imposed, they might be used by the government to reinforce this perception that it isn't the government, but actions against the government that are hurting them. En la segunda.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Daniela Vieira.
Good morning, I'm Maria Elena Vieira from Venezuela. My question is to Ambassador Luisa Benzo. No, I am just from Venezuela. I live in Washington, but I'm just from Venezuela. No, I don't work for the embassy. I'm just from Venezuela. My question has to do with what is your perception within the OAS, because as a Venezuelan and part of civil society, I see that any change, perceived as change, positive change of actions by the government have meant that the pressure has less effect, and then it's not talked about as much. So everybody says, well, at least they did this, and then the pressure is relieved a bit. So my question is, if the Venezuelan government, in this case Nicolás Maduro, does away with the assembly, what would be the level of commitment with the G14 to continue exercising pressure, and so that doesn't mean that the countries let their guard down and just wait for something else before they put more pressure on Venezuela? And the other question over here, and then we'll conclude with that. Buenos días. Dee Parvaz, reportera de Global Policy.
Considering unilateral oil sanctions.
Who do you address the question?
To the whole panel, because just wait for the question.
All right.
So if the U.S. does go ahead with these unilateral oil sanctions, I'm curious to know how you feel, the panel feels, this will impact any kind of international intervention that you were talking about, how it will affect or deepen the humanitarian/human rights crisis /catastrophe/emergency, and how it will impact any future recovery, because you have to look beyond what's happening now to how the path to recovery, right? That's the whole point. So I'd love to hear the thoughts of everybody on the panel. Thank you.
Excellent question. Thank you. So let's start with the first one. Sin constituyente, el compromiso del G14.
Okay, if there is no constituent assembly, what's the position of the G14? Well, I don't think we're going to see that happen, and it would be wrong to assume that it would happen. Unfortunately, the likelihood of them going ahead with the Constituent Assembly is extremely high. But in either scenario, I do agree that the pressure needs to remain applied. Last year, just because we saw a prisoner be released or what have you, the underlying issues are still there, and so the pressure needs to continue until there is a roadmap. If general elections were chosen, that would be the easiest path forward. for addressing the problems. The G14, in my opinion, what it needs to do is to not worry about the pressure of the Caribbean. I think that's something that needs to be worked on more in the medium term. And what we could do now is, in addition to just coordinating better with the U.S. and Canada, is to just work regionally. There's support in Europe and probably support from some Asian states, perhaps even some African states. That's what we need to do. Now, I don't think there would be any use in taking it to the United Nations. I know the mechanics very well of what that would look like, and I think that there would be solidarity with Venezuela expressed there. But what we need to do is send the signal that this concern is not limited to the hemisphere. The hemisphere has a central role to play, but it is backed by a lot of other people.
To try to answer that difficult question, if the U.S. goes ahead with the unilateral sanctions, the future of the recovery, in terms of humanitarian crisis, in terms of democracy, in terms of international intervention. Francisco.
Well, let me talk about the economy. I do think that there's a risk here that there will be lasting effects which will make a recovery much more difficult. I mean, if you think about the oil sector, you think about what sanctions, for example, impeding American firms from doing business with PDVSA would entail. They would entail things like Chevron, Schlumberger, Halliburton, essentially pulling out of Venezuela. I mean, these are fundamental to the country's oil infrastructure. It would entail probably a divestment of PDVSA from Citgo. PDVSA would be forced to sell Citgo. By the way, there's no way that PDVSA can do that without lifting a lien that it has on Citgo, which guarantees some bonds that it issues. So it would have to pay back these bonds. It would have to come up with $4 billion cash in order to pay the bonds. If it doesn't have that, it would force a default on these bonds, and would very likely force a default across the whole curve. So the country would probably go through a disorderly default in which many vulture funds would come in and try to sue PDVSA in order to try to seize its assets. So I think it could create a mess that would be very hard for PDVSA. It would take time, and it wouldn't be impossible, but it would take a lot of time and a lot of effort for PDVSA to recover from that in a scenario of transition.
2 minutes and a half. 1 minute, Beatriz.
Okay, trataré de ser breve. Creo que los próximos días.
I think that pressure and solidarity are going to be the most important thing. I think that that's what's going to have the best impact for Venezuelans. We want a peaceful transition to get out of this emergency. And of course, we're going to need to build a new country. And so we need support and action more than sanctions, which could hurt the Venezuelan people. Yes, individual sanctions, yes, for those who are responsible, but we don't want to keep dying of hunger. Along the same lines as Beatriz, I believe it's important to understand that if we want successful negotiations, we need to have both parties at the table, which is very unlikely now owing to the level of polarization. But we believe in a peaceful solution. We don't want to exacerbate the situation. We want to recognize whatever progress is made. I do think that the Constituent Assembly is a step back, but we applauded the transfer to house arrest for Leopoldo Lopez. So, as an example, that's what we need to do. So just to wrap up, historically, sanctions, the Secretary General already referred to the case of South Africa. I'd say that they have a quite varied track record, and one would have to make a very careful analysis of what kinds could work and which ones might not. But we absolutely have to distinguish between multilateral sanctions and unilateral sanctions. I would be worried that unilateral sanctions would not be done in a coordinated way with the countries that are working together. And we don't have the political will or the institutional forum to get multilateral sanctions. So I shouldn't say this as an ambassador, but I think that regardless of what sovereign nations might decide, it would be good that all nations take into account the impact that any actions might have on the cohesion within the G14, so we don't end up further away from a solution than we are right now.
Has put a lot of effort to create what is called a tracker. You can visit the website, and thanks to the work of Beatriz, Francisco, and many others, you will find critical information to understand how difficult is the situation in Venezuela. With that information and with those explanations, today I think we understand better what is going on in this Caribbean country. Thank you very much.
Thank you.